We're starting high on Everest, trying to descend the technical northeast ridge, having summited without supplemental oxygen.
So I saw from the distance at 10 that it doesn't make sense thinking about it now, but it's obviously the lack of oxygen, where I thought it was a tent off in the distance. And it was a tent that was destroyed in my mind, that had been destroyed by the high altitude winds and sun, etc. But I aimed for that tent on the ridge, and I thought, I'm just going to crawl into the remnants of that tent and take a nap. I know I'm not going to wake up, but at least I've had a long nap. And as I got closer to the tent, it wasn't a tent, it was a person, and they were napping, and they'd been napping for a year in the snow, and he had a Canadian flag on his high altitude suit. And I think that's what it's interesting. What that taught me there is that my mind was trying to shut me down, but I was able to keep going. I went on for hours and hours until I got back to my tent at high camp.
I've been fortunate to speak to many great adventurers in the course of making this podcast. Today we're going to hear from one of the most complete all-rounders that it's been my good fortune to speak to. Laval St Germain is a Canadian who's climbed the highest mountain on every continent, the 7 summits, including Everest from the north side, without supplemental oxygen. He was the first Canadian to do so. When he visits a new country, he always tries to summit its highest peak, and he visits a lot of countries because he's a commercial airline pilot. And he doesn't just climb. Of course he skis, treks, canoes, and ocean rows. He clocked the fastest solo Atlantic row. But wait until you hear about his bicycle commute to work. Even that's extreme. We'll also touch on family life. Yes, he does have one. And how, as time ticks away on all of us, how he fits it all in. I was asked to be a guest on the podcast he co-hosts, the Adventure Audio podcast, and I agreed, provided he came on mine. And of course, in the middle of all the flying, adventuring, and public speaking, he took on co-hosting a podcast as well. Clearly, there are more hours in a Laval day than in most people's. Why would he do that?
It's interesting. It was one of these things that I just fell into, quite literally. So I was asked by Pete Hockenhull, my co-host of the Adventure Audio podcast and the guy who started it, to replace the former co-host, who was the U.S. cyclist Tyler Hamilton, who raced with Lance Armstrong. So a Tour de France rider, quite a well-known guy, and the guy who wrote the tell-all book about the Armstrong legacy.
Read it.
So they had the Adventure Audio podcast, and they had found me somehow and interviewed me on the podcast. That's how I first became aware of Pete. And then I did what's called an Everesting. So I'm sure your listeners and viewers will know what an Everesting is, but that's when you either ride or run up one hill or mountain repeatedly until you've gained the elevation of Everest, which is 8,848 meters. And I did a 10,400 or 10,300 meter Everesting on my bicycle in the mountains in British Columbia, where I just kept repeatedly riding up and down a mountain for I think it was about 21 or 22 hours until I got to a 10,000 plus meter Everesting. And so I was on Pete's other podcast, speaking of busy people, the Everesting podcast. And then when Tyler Hamilton, he started his family late in life. And when he decided to spend more time with the family and then he couldn't cram in the podcast, they asked me to replace Tyler. So I was a bit taken aback because I had no illusions that I'd be a podcaster, and so here we are.
I mean, we'll get on to the real Everesting a little bit later, but because when I was writing the introduction to this, I thought, I genuinely did think, how does he fit it all in? And I was wondering what not your daily schedule is. Now, it couldn't be for every day because you don't know what country you're in. But for someone who's kind of juggling the adventure, the home life, and such a busy job that's laced with traveling as well, which gives you all these opportunities, but also cramming it all in, how do you manage to do it? And as a part of that question, how do you and what do you prioritize to be able to keep your body in the condition to be able to do those things?
Mm-hmm. So to go to start with the last part of your question first, and then we can move to the first part of your question. I think it's important that I think much like you, Simon, from knowing you, is that you make fitness and health a habit, just like brushing your teeth before you go to bed and when you wake up in the morning. If it's a non-negotiable part of your life, then there's no fitting it in. You just have to do it. And we had a podcast guest on. I don't know if we talked about this when we interviewed you, Simon, but he talked about health and fitness as being a table. And on that table, you have, in this example, your podcast, your career, your wife, your dog, your mortgage, your cottage, your apartment in Glasgow. Everything sits on that table, and that table is made up of your health. So you can't have any of that if you don't have your health. I mean, you can have some of it, but you can't fully enjoy all of those aspects of your life if you don't have health. So you have to maintain that table. And I don't know where that came from in my life, probably from my mom. My mom is 81 years old and she's extremely active. I was just at her place yesterday, 300 kilometers north of Calgary, and she's always out walking, cross-country skiing, cycling, traveling. She just came back from Ireland a few days ago. And so I think if you make it a non-negotiable thing, then it's not fitting it in. So how's that for starting with, I don't need to fit in my health and fitness. But for the real nitty-gritty aspect of it, wherever we stay, for example, my wife and I, Janet, when we travel, I always know where I'm going to get a run in. I always know where the local gym would be, or if there's a gym in the hotel or a local
You've
mall that I
researched
can
this,
run up.
you mean?
Yes. Yeah, you look ahead of time. And then you just figure out you're going to arrive at this time. It's going to have this much transportation time. I'm going to squeeze this in. Even if it's only 30 minutes, at least you're getting something in. Now, going back to juggling the career, an airline pilot is not that busy a job when it comes to, we have, because of the flight or the crew duty flight time requirements and the rest requirements, we get a lot of time off. So don't tell the management of the airline this, because I don't want them to make me work harder. And then I've just recently gone on, we can go on a reduced block, meaning a reduced schedule. And that's what I'm working right now. So it gives me more time for stuff like this, for adventuring, for spending time in the outdoors. And my side gig as a speaker. So and the kids have now grown up. They've both left the house. And yeah, suddenly I have even more time. But I was able to always cram it in. And back in the day when the kids were little, they would be part of that. So I'd be towing them around quite literally, or using them as a training weight on my back. So
that's a bit rocking. Instead of a weight, you've got it. Excellent way of doing it. But I listened to a podcast with you and Peter where you and I was going to come on this later, but this was almost insane. And your daily commute to work is by bicycle. Okay, that's not so big a deal. A lot of people do it, but in winter you do it. Just tell me how you prepare yourself, because it was like, I don't believe this. You're putting on so much stuff because it's so cold.
Yeah, we do get cold weather, obviously, here in Western Canada, but it's like anything, Simon. You have to have the right gear, right? And you get to know. I wake up in the morning and I check the weather, and I check the aviation weather, which is super accurate at the airport here in Calgary. And I know exactly what to wear based on the temperature. If it's minus 18 degrees, I know that I'm not going to need anything to prevent frostbite. If it gets down to minus 25, then I'll put tape over my cheeks and wear a full balaclava, and I'll change whatever footwear I'm wearing, or put pogies on my bike. So it's
what's
cold.
The tape for? Is that to stop it sticking?
Just to stop your face from freezing. So if you have any exposed skin around your goggles, you want that tape on there. So like kinesiology tape or kines tape, put that on there, and then that just stops any airflow that or any of that biting air that gets around your goggles. But by after a week of cold weather, I'll be the guy in the cockpit with a little bit of black charred skin here from frost snip. But it's really not that it's not that bad if you know how to dress and you have the right clothing.
Wow. And honestly, we think we get bad weather in Scotland, but my goodness me. It was from what I read, it was your dad who got you into flying and in the adventure side of life. Is that right? Just
Yeah.
explain a little bit to me how that came about.
Books, reading, and quite simply, that was it. National Geographic subscription at the house. Back in the day, I know that kids don't know what these are, but encyclopedias, Britannica and World Book encyclopedias, and reading those things. And there used to be a magazine in it's a U.S. magazine, but we got it in Canada. It was called Life magazine, a fairly famous magazine. And then books, famous Canadian authors like Farley Mowat, reading books like Tarzan, reading about the fur traders in the Canadian North and the explorers. And I just saw this world opening up in this small little rural village I grew up in north of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And it was beyond my abilities to, I mean, I could imagine it. I could travel there in my mind. And then my dad said to me, he said, if you want to go to all these places, then why don't you get your pilot's license? And eventually, if you get on with the airlines, you'll have the ability to travel to these places inexpensively. Plus, aviation just opens your mind or opens opens the world to you because of the vast distances you can travel. So that's what I did. And yeah, when I was 15, I started my training, and here we are, 40 years later.
Is that quite so common in northern Canada? I know at the time I spent in Alaska with Liz, everybody had a driveway at one side of the house and a sort of a runway at the other, because planes were just the way you got around. Is it more common in Canada to have a
No, it's not.
license,
It's
or
not
are you
like
still
that.
unusual?
No, it's not like that at all. Yeah, the Alaska bush scene, so we call that bush flying, is huge. I mean, you've also got 330 million people feeding that Alaska bush scene from the lower 48 states in the U.S. But it's not common to have a pilot's license here because you live in the north, but it is very common for people who want to get into aviation to start their careers being what's called bush pilots. So that's the thing that the whole world sees Canadian bush pilots as, flying a float plane with a radial engine, a beaver or an otter in the north. And that's exactly what I did. So I was very, very fortunate to be able to do that.
And was it a fairly straight line from that to flying the bigger planes, or is it just a natural progression?
Not really. I mean, everybody's, when I was 18, I was flying skydivers and off a little grass strip. And then I was doing forest fire patrols. Believe it or not, we would take airplanes and fly around for 8 hours a day looking for forest fires in the vast boreal forests in northern British Columbia. Then from there, I was flying a float plane up in the remote areas in northern Quebec, Hudson's Bay and James Bay. And then I was a ski bum for a winter, just skiing out in the Rocky Mountains. And there happened to be this airline, a regional airline, who was looking for pilots, and they gave me a call, and off I went. So, you start in a smaller twin engine airplane, and you work your way up. So that's sort of the Canadian way, where in the US, it's a vast number of pilots come through the military there, but we have such a small military that it's really not applicable here.
And I believe some of your family followed you into the
well, my younger
business.
brother.
Yeah.
Yep, my brother's a captain at the same airline I'm at.
Oh wow.
He's 9 years younger, and our oldest son became a pilot, and our youngest son Eric is a pilot, and he lives up in the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife. He's flying for the same airline I fly for, but a turboprop aircraft, not a jet.
Speaking of your family, I mean, you took them, and you mentioned this earlier. Tell me about some of the adventures you've taken them on. You've taken Namibia. You've taken them biking in the Arctic. Just how important is it you're not this guy who goes off and has his adventures around the world and then leaves Janet to look after the kids. It's a proper whole kind of thing, isn't it? Really, I mean, how important was it for you to make sure that you at least gave them the opportunities for that adventure that your dad gave you?
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, I didn't have the opportunities. My dad gave me the opportunities through reading, and I guess through becoming a pilot. But we didn't travel like that. I can remember only a few road trips, but we never flew internationally or anything like that. But fortunately for my kids, I had the ability to take them all over the world. So yeah, when they were small, we were in Namibia, and we've been in Kenya with Eric for his 10th birthday on a camping safari. We were sleeping out in tents in the Masai Mara, and they've been to the very remote rainforests in South America in a British colony called Guyana. And then, yes, when Richard, our oldest boy, and our daughter Andrea were 11 and 13, we rode this remote gravel highway in the Arctic from Dawson City, Yukon, up to the Arctic Ocean. And they are, yeah,
How
I
long
mean,
did that take?
I think it was 9 days to do it, or
Wow.
10 days.
And
I
they're
think it was
how
10
old?
days.
How old did you say?
They were 11 and 13. Yeah, it's
Crikey,
this
that's
gravel.
a thing.
Yeah, it is a thing, but it's surprising, Simon, what people can accomplish when they don't know what they're doing. I still remember, I still, I still remember day one. It was, I think it was 70 or 70 kilometers the ride that day. And my daughter Andrea looked at this map, at this sort of this tourist thing, this map board, and she said, "How far did we?" Or she knew where we were. It was called Tombstone, and she put her thumb and her finger on the map, and she said, "Okay, Dad, we've ridden this far, but we have this far to go." Wow, and they didn't know any better, so they averaged
Yeah.
88 kilometers a day with gravel, on gravel with those bikes, but they were long days, but
That's
it was
good.
fantastic.
Was it not scary for you? I mean, because you knew what they were doing. The responsibility.
No, no, I think the only thing you're concerned about when you have kids that young on a trip like that is that they're going to have a breakdown and not want to go any further. But it was fantastic. Like it's one of those things in my life that is far more precious than any of the major notorious expeditions I've done, because of the fact it was time well spent with my kids in a spectacular part of the world, and then we may touch on this later, but we've lost Richard since then. So it's just a great memory, and highly recommend it to drag your kids along on these adventures. It makes the memories even sweeter. It's tough. It's a lot of work, but it makes it a lot sweeter.
If you feel able to, could you tell me
Mhm.
about Richard now? Then it was
Sure.
2014,
Yeah.
as I understand it.
Exactly. Yeah. So coming up on 10 years now, Simon, Richard became a bush pilot just like me. And he flew up to the Northwest Territories to start his career. His first job when he was 21 was to fly for a small air taxi operator, we call it, in a town called Norman Wells. And Norman Wells is on the Mackenzie River. And the Mackenzie River is the second largest river in North America after the Mississippi in the US. And Richard had been up there for about 3 weeks, almost a month, and he was having the time of his life. And the Canadian Arctic in the summertime is a place of 24-hour daylight, beautiful days, and it's a spectacular part of the world. And he started to court a young lady who was from Toronto and had a summer job at the local hotel as a waitress, as a server. And one night she was working, and he cajoled her into going canoeing on the Mackenzie River. And to make a long story short, the canoe capsized. He stayed with the canoe. She started swimming for shore. Just by luck, there was a person talking on a phone outside of a house near the riverbank of the Mackenzie River, and heard him yelling for help. They were able to get in a boat, save the young lady, and when they turned the boat around to head for Richard, he had disappeared. So I got that dreadful, tragic phone call that every parent uh, has nightmares about, where I got a call from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at 2:30 in the morning that Richard had been involved in a canoe mishap and that he was missing. And I told the constable that I know that river, I know where it occurred, and I think you and I both know what that means. And he said, "Yes, I'm afraid I do." And that was it. It was like a
Mm.
bomb went off, and so I sat for 14 minutes in the room, because that night I was sleeping in our youngest son's bed. Eric, he crawled into our bed earlier, so I jumped into his bed, and I sat there for 14 minutes in the dark, making a plan on how I was going to make sure that the family came out of this healthy, and how I was going to do it, how I was going to talk, and tell a woman that she's lost her firstborn. And it was, it was the toughest thing for sure that I've ever done. And,
Wow.
but life goes on, right? You have to, we still find joy in life. We still laugh. We still have fun. We still travel. We spoke about him yesterday. I was on a bike ride and I passed a young guy who reminded me of Richard, and he must have thought I was so strange the way I was staring at him as I rode by. But it was nice and it was tragic. But it's we're not not exceptional in the fact that
And
we
you went
lost
back.
somebody.
You went back to the Mackenzie River with Eric,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. So the next summer, Eric and I flew up to this remote, beautiful village on Great Bear Lake, one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world, no road access, and a place called Delaney. And we spent some time in Delaney, and then we, due to the um, hospitality of the local Dene people up there, they gave us a canoe, and Eric and I just canoed down the Great Bear River to the Mackenzie as a way to, I don't know, confront it or deal with it, or just be there. And it was another special trip for sure.
Is there an overriding lesson you've taken from that and all your other adventures? I'm not putting them on a par when I say that. I just wonder
Yeah.
because you can't put an adventure alongside a loss of a son. But I'm just wondering what, if anything, shaped a philosophy or an outlook.
I don't think I've changed in any sense when it comes to the practicality or the procedures, if you want to say, that I use in the backcountry or in the remote areas of the world. But you are just, you have a new awareness of death. And you never want to say that you take anything positive away from a tragedy like that, but you do get some. People talk about PTSD, but I think it might be, depending on how you as an individual and your family handle it, you can get some post-traumatic growth out of it, I think, instead of um, um, an always I don't even know how I'm trying to say this, but you do get something out of it, and it's
Well, it
a
shapes you.
respect. It does shape you, and but you also can't navel gaze too long about it, because it's not
Yeah.
unique. It's not unique to lose somebody. It's not unique to go through tragedy. Tragedy is part of life, just like happiness is. And it's just it happiness. Happiness will give you some good memories, but it won't give you any scars. And tragedy gives you scars, and I think those scars are always there to remind you of Richard reminds us that he's stuck at 21 forever, and you and I both know at 21 we were at the height of our powers. The whole world was in front of us, and to me, that's the tragedy: is a life that was unrealized. So
Yeah.
more for him than it is for us. Like, I feel so badly for him, and I don't sit there and dwell on the way his loss has made us feel. I just think, what a loss of opportunity. And to be really clear, it was a mistake he made. Like most deaths are, it's a mistake. He did not have a life jacket on. And if he would have put a life jacket on, he'd be alive today.
From what I've read about you, it struck me that you're a list ticker. Very pilot approach to things. I'm seeing all the notes around you on video. All your boxes are labeled there, all apart from that black one behind you on your left. And as part of this list, you've got this thing of climbing the highest mountain in each country, and the highest mountain on each continent as well. And I've never spoken to someone who's done the 7 summits. Was that? Am I right about the list ticking or the list making? And was it therefore inevitable that the 7 summits would find you?
Yes. So to me, the idea of checking off these iconic places as a list almost degrades them to a point. But I guess, to be practical about it, it is a list. But so is a goal. Any goal is checking off anything, whether it's starting a podcast or editing a YouTube video, or planning to travel to Portugal to see the Douro Valley. Whatever it is, that's a goal. And you I accidentally fell into the Seven Summits thing because I suddenly realized just through my travels that I'd climbed the highest mountain at that time in South America, North America, and Africa. And I thought, well, that's 3 out of 4. I might as well just keep going and keep that as a side, project that I was sort of working on. There was a gap in there when the kids were young, and I was really busy with my career, and then one day I picked it up again. And I think it's important that we have goals, and whether you call it a list or whether you call it a goal, I don't really know if it matters. But and then your reference to climbing the highest mountain on in all the countries I go to. I mean, it's fun, and we've spoken about this earlier, and I actually made a video that I'll have to send you of me. The morning after we spoke, I was in northern Vietnam, and it was night for me, late at night when I spoke to you. And the next morning, I got up very early in the morning. Actually, I had set it up just after a call, and I ended up running up the highest peak in Vietnam. And I made a video to you, and I'll have to
As you
include,
do.
yeah.
This is because I teased you, didn't I? When we were doing our conversation, I sort of said to you, "How do you know the highest is the best?" And you gave me a great answer. He says, "Well, best is subjective. Highest is objective." So,
Yeah.
and it was a
And
great reply.
it was your wife who had
Yeah,
the
it was
question, why
Liz.
does he
Yeah,
do the
that's right.
highest? And nobody'd ever asked me that. So as I was going up Fansipan, the highest mountain in Vietnam, and which has been bespoiled at the top by a gondola, a cable car that goes to the top now, which just has ruined it. However, as I was approaching the summit, looking over the jungles of Vietnam, and the sun was rising, and I was thinking about your wife's question via you, and I still didn't get a proper answer. But when I go to these areas, you you are in a part of that country that is special to that country generally, and and it's not the most beautiful mountain, it's not the best mountain. I don't know what that means or what that would be, but I think what it also does is when you meet people from that country later in life, it will somehow cement some type of relationship, and you are somehow showing some respect to to that country or to the people in a strange way, and it's sort
You've
of
put effort
iconic
in.
for put effort in to be stand on, like, I stood on top of the highest mountain in Somalia, and Simon, you could have been in a grove of trees behind your house. Like, there, I was in tall trees. There was no view. It was just a GPS lat and long on a map, and I just stood there going, "Well, I don't know if you've seen the scene in Madagascar when the penguins go back to Antarctica and they look around and they go, 'This sucks,' and get back in the boat and leave." But it's I guess the word is it's just cool to do that stuff,
Yeah.
and now I have memories. I mean, I like watching cycle races. This Tour of Hungary is on right now, or is just finished, and the final mountain stage was up this peak that is just a rounded hill in Hungary. But I've been up there. It's the highest peak in Hungary. There's a paved
Oh,
road up one
fantastic.
side. I ran up the trail on the other, and I had a fantastic day. I was crossing wild boar tracks and seeing roebuck, and yeah, it's just something I love to do.
I apologize for using the phrase list ticker because that
No,
was
that's okay.
demeaning, and
It's
I shouldn't have used that.
it's not demeaning, it's accurate.
Oh, well, okay. But we can't do a conversation about the highest mountains and not talk a little bit about Everest. Uh, Everest, you chose from the Tibetan side, so
Mhm.
North Ridge, technically
Northeast.
harder. Northeast Ridge, okay, much less forgiving, much more prone to fickle weather, um, and yet without supplemental oxygen. How did all that come
Mhm.
about? I mean, was this one
Reading.
of these ones where you buy your way onto an expedition?
Yeah, so I did what's called a lead expedition. So in this case, what you do is you pay an outfitter for the permit, trucks to get you from Nepal to Tibet, and base camp tents and a base camp cook. And then you can add on. You can have Sherpas, you can have guides, you can have oxygen, blah blah blah. You can just keep on adding. So I had a lead expedition. You're not actually climbing with anybody. You can climb autonomously.
Mm-hmm.
And So to me, that was perfect. Very inexpensive. It was a budget expedition, and the food was dodgy. We had a quarter of a yak laying in the rocks beside the tent, and we'd cut slabs off that, and the cook would cook it. And that wasn't all the time, but yeah. So it was a lead expedition. So it wasn't a bespoke. I didn't have a Sherpa. I didn't have anything like that. I used them to get me to the base of the mountain, and then use their tents.
Do they
And the
fix
base
lines
camp
on the
cook.
north side, on the northeast ridge?
They do. Yeah, the team didn't, but what happens is Tibetans, a team will go in ahead of time and set up the fixed lines, and then all the expeditions pay. They throw in a certain 300 quid or something, and everybody pays for that line. The expedition does. So yeah, there are fixed lines on the north side. Some of them weren't up yet, but there were old lines you could use. Yeah, so that's how I did it, and then the north side, because of the fact that the first person to climb without oxygen, Reinhold Messner, the famous Italian climber, had done it from that side, and plus Tibet to me was just such a spectacular part of the world.
So obviously you're a fit guy. Are you a mountaineer as well? I mean, did you have the technical climbing skills? Because you're doing the yellow band just below the summit, and you've got some technical stuff on. It's not an easy climb.
Oh yeah, I've done technical mountaineering. Yeah,
right.
So
okay, so that's your background as well.
Yeah, I've climbed Denali by myself.
Of course, Denali. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
the east ridge of Mount Logan, which is a really classic alpine climb, and so yeah, I definitely had that. I wasn't a hill walker, so to speak, as you'd say in the UK.
Because you get a lot of people who would be going up the South Pole route who are probably fit hill walkers. And,
we had
the commercialization there.
Most people on the expedition and in that area were fit or unfit hill walkers. It was absolutely stunning and mind-blowing how little experience some people had. I mean, I saw people being taught how to put on crampons at the base of Mount Everest. Yes. Stunning. They didn't make it to the top, and some of the unfit hill walkers didn't make it. They're still up there.
Yeah.
But it is exactly what you read about in John Krakauer's Into Thin Air book. Identical.
Very, very big open question. Everest, when you got up there, what was it like?
It was overcast and snowing with no view, maybe 100 meters visibility. It was about minus 27, maybe ish, minus 30, I think. So not super cold.
That's a pilot's answer. Do you realize how pilot that answer is?
You're right. I'm giving you the weather conditions. Light winds, very little turbulence. And I said I was climbing with a Brit, Mark Del Stanch. He is a super yacht captain in the Mediterranean. And I looked at Mark and I said, 20 minutes, mate, not a second longer. I'm dying. I've got to get down. And we took the requisite pictures. I held up the sign to Janet and the kids. I tied a prayer scarf to the summit marker because Janet's dad had died just a few years earlier from cancer, and I had his name written on that. And then it really got hard on the descent. Mark and I Mark was climbing with oxygen. I wasn't. We got separated, and I started the solo descent. But what was it like? Every mountain I've been on, Simon, I feel exhilaration, and sometimes I break into tears because of all the effort and the beauty and the fact that you've accomplished something. But on a mountain as big as Everest, you know that you're not at the top.
Yeah.
I mean, you haven't done it yet until you get down alive. And I mean down to base camp alive, because there's so many places you can get the chop on the descent. And I didn't feel anything. I felt no joy. I felt no fear, no sense of accomplishment, just this knowledge that I was in for the battle of my life on the descent, and it turned out to be.
How did being without oxygen affect that descent?
Well, I mean,
sorry, without supplemental oxygen, you know what I mean? Yeah.
The only way I could compare is if I'd ever done it with oxygen. So I've got no.
But you've been down you've been down other mountains, and it's just. I
Yeah.
mean, you've got a very technical descent, which I presume is a mixture of down climbing and abseil. Is
rappelling
it?
and abseiling.
Yeah, of course,
Oh,
you're
yeah.
on a fixed line as well. But
Yep.
you've been without supplemental oxygen for a long time now, just by getting up and getting back down again. I'm just wondering, are you aware of the fact you can't breathe as easily?
Yeah, it's not that you can't breathe as easily. You're breathing like you are here, but you're breathing more rapidly, and it's obviously it would seem labored, but you are definitely aware. I mean, I have a very clear understanding of hypoxia and high altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, and I know that cerebral edema especially will make you. I mean, it's affecting your judgment, your thinking, and that is scary because you can't make any mistakes. And when you're descending, you are quite often just doing an arm abseil where the rope is wrapped around your arm and over your shoulder, and you're trying to, get down quickly that way. So you know that if you make a mistake, you're gonna fall to your death, and it's fairly.
So you're not clipped on the line.
So, sometimes you are, but on the descent, sometimes you do a very high speed wrap. Now, I wasn't in that particular case. I wasn't doing a high speed wrap. I was, walking 10 or 15 meters and sitting in the snow, 10 or 15 sitting in the snow, absolutely knackered. And and then eventually you're passing bodies, people that are trying to have tried to do the same thing you have, and eventually I came to a point where I was so to back it up a bit, I was told by an American climber that if you're climbing without oxygen, whatever you do not take a nap, because you're going to want to take a nap. You're going to want to sleep because you're going to be that exhausted, because if you nap, you're going to die. And I remember that clearly. I remember that phone call clearly when I was in Canada, when I was having that phone conversation with him, and I got to the point where I had to nap, and I remember the conversation clearly. And I knew that I was not going to wake up, but to me that was good because that meant a long nap. That's how absolutely terminally exhausted I was. So I saw from the distance a tent that it doesn't make sense thinking about it now, but it's obviously the lack of oxygen, where I thought it was a tent off in the distance. And it was a tent that was destroyed in my mind, that had been destroyed by the high altitude winds and sun, etc. But I aimed for that tent on the ridge, and I thought, I'm just going to crawl into the remnants of that tent and take a nap. I know I'm not going to wake up, but at least I've had a long nap. And as I got closer to the tent, it wasn't a tent, it was a person, and they were napping, and they'd been napping for a year in the snow, and he had a Canadian flag on his high altitude suit. And I think that's what. It's interesting. What that taught me there is that my mind was trying to shut me down, but I was able to keep going. I went on for hours and hours until I got back to my tent at high camp. And
wow.
Yeah, I think it shows you that even though your brain is telling you to give up and stop, that I just kept on going. And if it wouldn't, I don't know if it was the flag or anything like that. Maybe that made it, drove it home a little more. But the fact that he was taking a nap in the snow, and it turned out he was the last Canadian that tried to climb Everest without oxygen the year before. And so yeah, it was a tough descent. It was the toughest physical thing I've ever done, and I've done some fairly hard physical things. So it was this just a battle of it was a hazy, confusing, every step hurt battle to get down. And I had I had frozen my right hand about 2 hours after I left camp on the ascent. So I had three fingers that were like pieces of wood in my mitt, and it was on my right hand. So it made, handling carabiners and stuff difficult. And
yeah, you came back without them, I gather. Yeah.
Well, I brought him home, and then I left him in a hospital in Calgary.
So does that get in the way when you're flying?
No. Transport Canada tested me. They did what's called a medical flight test, which is incredibly rare. And they put me in the mountains in a simulator, and they made me do all these tough approaches. And they wanted to see if I had brain damage from hypoxia and if my fingers would work. Yeah. It's no problem.
Did being a pilot help you when you were having to get to Vinson to complete your 7? Was it you? Because I hear that Vinson is quite a difficult one to access because it's Antarctic. That may have changed.
No, it's not difficult. There's a company called ALE that uses
All
a
right.
Canadian bush operation to fly people in there. No, it's not complicated at all. I mean, Antarctica's it's now for the so there's some true adventurers there, but it's mainly for the well-heeled who want to run a marathon at the near the South Pole or look at penguins but yeah, you have to have the funds to get down. It's very expensive to get down there. So it's
Yeah.
quite a flight on an older Russian cargo machine to get down there. So
But you were going to do something else. You're going to do two expeditions at one when you were down there, but one of them didn't
yep.
work out. So we've got a little time. Can we just
Yes.
run into that one? I'd like to talk about
Yeah,
that, and
and
I'd like to
that's
talk about Iran, and then anybody else who wants to catch up on your adventures, they're going to have to listen to your podcast.
Sure. The plan was to do a solo ski to the Hercules Inlet route to the South Pole, and I had a sled made by a well-known Norwegian sled manufacturer, and they sent a shipment of these Pulks sleds to Punta Arenas, and mine was in the shipment, and they were all stacked together. These lightweight Kevlar Pulks sleds, and I took mine out and put it on the floor of this concrete sort of warehouse that I was in, and it was warped. So let's say the front right corner was in the air and the back left corner was up in the air, and it wasn't sitting flat. So I was like, what the heck? And all the other ones in the shipment were fine. So FaceTime video, talking to the engineers or the manufacturers, and actually it was in Germany, but the company's a Norwegian company, I guess. And we're discussing this, and I'm taking measurements, and they said, well, with the load in there, everything should be fine. And it was initially, because you've got 250 pounds of equipment in there, and it flexes the sled flat. But then as I burnt through food and fuel as I was towing it to the South Pole, it now would shoot off. You do 5 or 6 steps, and it would go off to the right at a 40-degree angle, and you'd have to sidestep over, do it again. So I would tie the lines to a different corner. I tried everything. I'd move the load, and it came to the point where you just could not. It was like dragging a tire through the snow, because the sled would not track behind you, would shoot off on an angle. So it was slowing me down to the point where I had to look at the calendar and go, if I'm not at the South Pole by this date, I'm not going to be able to get to Vinson and climb Vinson. So I had to have them on a supply mission to the South Pole come and pick me up and fly me back to sort of I guess where everybody lands, and then after that I went to Vinson. So yeah, a huge screw up on my part. Now I hired a lawyer. I went after them, and it never worked out to get my money back for these sleds. These sleds are expensive. However, it was still my fault, because I could have insisted that I'm not taking that sled, and that I could have used another sled that was in that warehouse. I think if I would have pushed the issue, I could have gotten a perfectly straight sled. And the most tragic thing about this, it's not a real tragedy, but is that when ALE came to pick me up, when I couldn't pull the sled anymore, they said, why don't you just use one of our sleds, which are perfectly straight, the same make, same model, but nobody had offered that previous. So now, if I would have accepted that sled, then I would have had assistance, and it wouldn't have been a pure solo ski to the South Pole. So I can't accept assistance, so I can't do that. But yeah, that was it was supposed to be a unsupported ski to the South Pole.
So is that unfinished business?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right.
Don't we all have unfinished business?
Oh, crikey, yes. Some of my unfinished business is never going to get finished, as far as I'm concerned. Iraq, completely off the wall. Tell me about climbing the high. This is probably one of your, we're here, let's climb the highest mountain in this country trips. That strikes me as quite dangerous.
This one was a goal. Right,
okay.
Yeah, it was something that I had read about somewhere. I'd seen probably National Geographic. I'd probably seen an article on it or something about the Zagros Mountains along the Iranian-Iraqi border. And being my vintage, which is roughly the same as yours, Simon, I grew up with tales of the Iran-Iraq War, and my commercial flying instructor. So the guy that trained me on my for my commercial pilot license was a guy named Ali Abershamian, and he was a former fighter pilot from Iran who had escaped after 1979 and come to Canada. And he was actually the Shah of Iran's daughter's bodyguard at one point. He has a story of skiing in St. Moritz with an Uzi under his ski jacket, but he fell and broke his ankle on that trip, so he was laid up. However, I had grown up with stories of Iran. And for people who don't know Iran, if they know it in the current context, it sounds like this brutal part of the world, but it has a long, rich history, and it's a beautiful country. So I had been to Iran climbing. I had climbed and skied down Gamavan, the highest mountain in Iran, which was absolutely spectacular. So I had climbed the highest mountain in Iran. I thought, I'm going to try and climb the highest mountain in Iraq. So it's called the Chikadar. It's in Kurdistan. You can't get into that region because it's right on the border with Iran. Actually, the summit is in Iran. It's a few meters in Iran, and I decided I want to ski it on telemark skis. So telemark skis are those skis where your heels are not fastened down. And I was able to make my way into the Zagros Mountains, in this magical part of the world, and climb it. And it worked out really well until the descent, when I was coming back through all these military checkpoints. They found out where I was, and they interrogated me. They arrested me for about a day. Well, not, I mean, it wasn't overnight, but the entire day of being interrogated, and eventually they let me go. So it added a little spice to the trip.
But did I read something about a minefield involved there? Or was it just
there's it's one of the most heavily mined areas on Earth, and that's why they don't want people in there. And it's also the spot where a few years previously, a group of Americans were hiking in the area, and they went in to see a waterfall, and some Iranian militia kidnapped them, and they were held for, I think, a couple of years. The one girl was released early. There's 3 Americans, young Americans. So I was very concerned about being kidnapped, because you could see the Iranian machine gun posts from my tent. There's nobody in them because it was wintertime, but I didn't know that for sure. Late winter, and it's I don't want to make the story too long, but the first morning in the middle of nowhere, I had a human cough outside my tent, and I unzipped the tent to see, as the tent fly was coming up, there was a guy standing there with the butt of a rifle on the ground, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to be kidnapped. And it was a Kurdish villager who was hunting for ibex, and he had just wandered up and seen my tent. And we had this really interesting exchange, Simon, where I shared a chocolate bar with him. I had an instant coffee, and we shared out of the same cup this coffee, and we had this sign language conversation, me, this 21st century Westerner, and this Kurdish tribesman with this single shotgun hunting ibex in the mountains of Kurdistan. And shortly after that was the rise of ISIS. And I'm sure that this young man, because he was of fighting age, would have been participating in fighting ISIS as a Kurd for the Peshmerga. So yeah, it's an amazing part of the world. And if you'd see photos of where I was, it looked like Austria or Switzerland or the Canadian Rockies.
Amid all this, and you mentioned Kurdistan there, amid all these great adventures and flying around the world or something, we had a little sort of, I suppose, village party last weekend. And I was speaking to one of my neighbors who was telling me, and he was saying, yeah, my brother's on a bit of a cycle ride at the moment. Haven't seen him for ages. He's over 70 now. He's riding through the mountains of Kurdistan. And he's got this, I was like, well, what sort of bikes he got? He's got some little molten thing with tiny wheels. And does he have a tent? I don't know what he's got. It doesn't seem to take much. And he's, and I thought, this guy went a long way. And it's just, you don't need a lot of adventure to do, a lot of kit and a lot of planning and lots.
You don't.
It's here, isn't it? It's without banging my microphone. It's here.
It is there. And when you are doing these things, Simon, what you know is that you must put up some type of pheromone or something that lets people know that you are available to provide aid to, or to provide guidance to. Because if you're walking down the street of Glasgow or Edinburgh, I don't think people are coming up to you and chatting with you or offering you things. Or
actually, in Glasgow, they probably are. Glasgow's just like that.
But
I take your point.
About something about putting yourself out there that somehow fosters better relationships with people, and people want to see foreigners in their country enjoying their country. And if you're doing it at the speed of life, meaning on a bike or walking, then it's even better.
Yeah, no glass in the way, apart from these things.
That's right.
Where's the next country you're going to be flying to that hasn't had your feet on the summit of its highest point?
I don't know yet. I'm working hard at a trip to Central Asia, so we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
And I want to go back and do, we were just in Vietnam, as we were talking earlier, and there's a fantastic bicycle route I can do there through the mountains of northern Vietnam, and it just looks fantastic. Taiwan is on my list for places to go. I mean, it never ends. And then, of course, there's the Canadian Rockies, which are about 80 kilometers behind me right now, there's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah, you can't neglect them. You can't neglect your own home ground.
No. And as you know, there's always another adventure.
And you just know there will be another adventure for Laval. I have said that if he finds himself in Scotland, I'll take him up a mountain, and I think it will be An Chelac. Or if he insists on it being Ben Nevis, we'll go up by the Arret route. That is me saying, I'll take you up a mountain to a 7-summiteer. My goodness, the conceit. Anyway, please check out the Adventure Audio podcast, co-hosted by Laval and Peter. It really is worth a listen. If you've enjoyed this one, can I trouble you to buy me a coffee, please? It's a small amount of cash, and it goes to the hosting fees and Zoom charge. It totals around £30 a month, and that comes out of my own pocket because I do these for fun and to meet interesting folk like Laval and to share them with you. There's a link in the show notes and at alwaysanother adventure.com. I'm Simon Willis. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.